Okay. I hardly slept last night. I was really thrilled about being able to speak here for the first time since the early 90s when I was the director of seminars. And you'd think this would be old hat to me, but there's been a long absence, and it kind of feels like the first time. And I can't tell you how gratifying it is to come back here and to see just how strong Phi has become. It was at a low ebb when Dr. Senholtz and I came over here to just try to keep things going for a while. And I'm just so thrilled with the program that Larry Reed and Ben Stafford and the others here have set up. The many different seminars they're holding this summer, the wonderful faculty. I mean, what a humbling experience to follow after speakers like Sheldon and Tony and Ben and the others. And also, I've gotten a chance to know a few of you in the last couple of days, and I'm really impressed with the quality of students we have here. So I think that's why I was excited. It was a little like when I was a freshman in college after going to an all-boys boarding school, and all of a sudden I'm at a co-ed institution, and I could have, there were girls to ask out, and that always used to make me a little nervous, and I think that's a little bit how I felt last night. Anyhow, let's talk about this monopoly thing. What's wrong with monopoly? Why would anybody object to monopoly? What are we afraid of? What's the big problem?
Loss of competition.
Okay, we think that with the lack of competition, the monopolist is going to abuse us, take advantage of us. From an economic standpoint, we would say without competition, the monopolist is likely to be inefficient, not make an optimum use of scarce resources. So they are a problem. But are all monopolists abusive or inefficient? Does that automatically come with the status of having a monopoly, of being the sole provider of a good or a service? Not necessarily, because there are two kinds of monopolies. There are two ways a firm can achieve monopoly status. There's the economic way, and there's the political way. The economic way, of course, is that a firm becomes a monopolist by virtue of being so efficient, so well received by customers, that no other firm can successfully enter the market and compete with them. On the other hand, a political monopoly is established by political intervention. It's a favor, a privilege that's conferred upon the monopolist by the state. And that's kind of, that's what is ironic about this. We asked, do we need laws against monopolies? And so we're asking the government to rescue us from monopolies when usually government is the agent that establishes the kind of monopoly that is abusive toward us. As was already said, the competition from others is the great antidote. It's the protection that a consumer has against monopoly. It's that competition. When that competition is denied by the political powers that be, you have people getting ripped off. And that's why, of course, we resent and distrust monopolies. And in the age of mercantilism, we date the emergence of modern economics from Adam Smith writing in the 1770s. And that was on the heels of several centuries of a period, at least in European history, known as the age of mercantilism, where it was a very common practice for the monarch to confer upon a strategic ally a monopoly. Say, look, you've got the privilege of being in command of this particular industry. And of course, it was a quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I scratch your back. You get this monopoly status. You get to charge higher than you otherwise would because no competition is permitted to go up against you. And while you're at it, share the spoils with me, the monarch. It was a fundraising technique for the monarch, and of course, it was a fundraising technique for the monopolist. And Adam Smith, among other teachings about the free market, was very much anti-monopolist. And at the time of the emergence of the United States of America, we've always had a historical distrust of monopoly. And people should, because of the way monopolies have been abusive over history. What about in the modern era? are accustomed to having been in this country where it's a relatively free market. But there are places in the world where monopoly is the order of the day. Those would be the socialist and the centrally planned economies. Because, after all, in a socialist economy where the government owns all the means of production, the government is the monopoly. When you were in the Soviet Union and you needed some shoes, you got it from the state shoe store. The quality might not be very good. So what? Take it or leave it. Where else are you going to get it? Well, maybe a black market if you wanted to risk being arrested by the KGB for a crime against the state. If you wanted milk, where would you go? The state store, the state monopoly. Anything you can think of. Toilet paper, state store, monopoly. Socialism is one big system of monopoly. So the monopoly idea is still out there. And you'd think, well, you know, it's great in this country that we don't want to have monopolies. We'd say, well, we don't want to be socialistic. Except that some of our political leaders are moving us in that direction. There's kind of a paradox involved there. Let me give you some examples of some market-based monopolies. Can anybody think of one? Anybody know of a monopoly in the United States of America today?
Post office?
Well, the post office, which is, of course, a politically established monopoly. Does anybody... yes?
Processors, Intel and AMD.
Well, I guess I don't know if there are smaller firms nibbling at the corners of their business or not. That would technically be a duopoly. Boeing is probably the most famous one, I think, because they're the only manufacturer of jumbo jets. Alcoa once was considered a monopoly, maybe close to 50 years, according to the economist Thomas Sowell. They were just so consistently efficient at producing aluminum that it just didn't make sense for other firms to go up against them. There are actually lots of little monopolies in our country, but the feds leave those alone. One example is I have a lot of relatives who live out west. And a couple summers ago, I was in John Day, Oregon. There's a cute little story about how the town got its name. I always wonder who John Day was, that the town was named after him. He was just an early settler who had been captured by the Indians and managed to escape without any clothes on his back, but he got back to civilization, and he's been famous in Oregon history ever since. So there in central Oregon, which is way off the beaten path, there's a monopoly food store called Chester's. And the prices are higher there than you would pay if you went to a grocery store in Portland or Salem or one of the other cities. You could say that Mr. Chester, I don't know if it's a first name, last name, or nickname, but Chester, whoever he is, seems to be taking advantage of his monopoly situation. And yet, the market there just isn't big enough to sustain a second store. And I'd like to cut Chester a little bit of slack here and say that perhaps he's justified in charging higher prices. Because when you think about it, in order to get supplies to him, the various wholesalers have to drive off the beaten path. The cost for transporting goods to this remote location per unit of good is higher. I mean, Chester will have a higher cost structure than somebody in a major city on a major thoroughfare, because somebody's got to deliver the stuff way out of the way in a relatively small quantity. So everybody pays for that. So Chester's actually delivering something of economic value. He's performing a service, because if nobody performed that service, the people would really be up a creek. And of course, the way they cope with it is people will often drive to the large cities to get their staples that can be boxed and canned. You know, your cereal, your beans, etc. You stock up on those once a month. You take the pickup over to Portland and you fill it up with things that are going to last you for the next year. But for the perishables, you know, the vegetables and the meat and the milk and so on and so forth, you're pretty dependent on Chester. And that's understandable, though, in terms of the market. He has to be compensated for his higher cost structure. He has to make enough of a profit to stay in business. He can't charge way too much because somebody else would come in and take his market away from him. Give you another example of a small monopoly, and it'll give me an opportunity to explain what a consumer's defense is. What is our protection in the market? What are the natural protections that the marketplace has to shield us from these predatory monopolies? Well, there's a little business in western Pennsylvania called Scenographics. It's a monopoly. It's my wife's business. Perhaps even some of you who live here in the States your school might have used the service. We supply blueprints to the theater programs around the country showing people how to build their sets for the common plays and musicals. And it's over 30 years old now since Eileen had that inspirational idea. And we have no competition. So, are we ruthless, greedy monopolists exploiting our monopoly position? Well, no. And here's why. There's a great article that was published in the Freeman in the 60s by the aforementioned Hans Sennholz, former president of FEE, my mentor, one of 4 people to have earned a PhD in economics under the tutelage of Ludwig von Mises at New York University. And the article was called The Phantom Called Monopoly. The phantom. It's like a boogeyman. It's not a real threat in a market economy. Scenographics is not going to be able to go out there and throttle the schools, rip them off, charge them an arm and a leg for our product. Why? Well, nobody's telling us we can't. We're not regulated by the government. We can charge whatever we want. Why don't we want to charge more than we do? Well, this is because of the threat of competition. The very first antidote to monopoly in a market economy is freedom of entry. So you have to look, and you're in business, you look at competition in 2 ways. There's your actual competition, and there's your potential competition. And if we got all excited about our monopoly position, doubled or tripled prices, what do you think would happen? Some other profit-seeking, enterprising individual or a group of individuals would say, hey, look at the markup in that business. Let's get a piece of that action. We can enter that market and undercut Scenographics, charge them a lower price. Well, it's not that big a market, at least that's been our experience. I'm sure my wife views it as a service, so we're not aggressive advertisers. We're probably not maximizing profit. We're not maximizing market penetration because she just views it as a service. We're there if people want to use us. But nonetheless, we feel that if we charge too much, that will invite competition and we'll actually be worse off. So actual competition or potential competition, as long as there's freedom of entry, a monopolist does not have a secure position, does not have unbridled ability to stick it to the consumer. The second factor that Dr. Sennholz pointed out in the phantom called monopoly is the substitution factor. People can substitute goods. Say the regional ski resort doubles its lift fees. Well, there will be some people who say, nuts to skiing. I'm going to take up bowling. I'm going to take up bridge. Who knows? There are a lot of different ways people can amuse themselves. You can substitute something that's less expensive when something else gets too high priced. You have a bad frost that makes the price of grapefruit skyrocket. Well, maybe you'll substitute oranges. Or maybe the whole citrus crop is wiped out that year, so you substitute apples. Or maybe you substitute M&Ms and Kit Kats. I don't know, whatever floats your boat there. But there's the substitution effect. You can't just assume that people want exactly what you have. There are other ways, from our perspective, there are other ways people can provide sets for their plays and musicals. They can hire a local designer, they can just wing it themselves, whatever. So there's the substitution effect. And then the third is simply the old microeconomic principle of the elasticity of demand. And for those of you who have never studied economics, elasticity is kind of an unfortunate term, I think. It suggests the laws of physics, which we don't believe pertain to the logical study of economics. But the elasticity of demand refers to how responsive consumer demand is to changes in price. Like, for example, when the price of gasoline a year ago peaked at about $4 a gallon, after having just been under $2 a gallon a year or so before that, what was the effect on demand? Well, demand declined in America 6%. Very little, considering such a huge, more than a doubling of the price. We would say that the demand for gasoline at this stage in the United States is very inelastic. But for most goods have a more elastic demand than that. And that just simply means if the price goes up, some people will just say, forget it. We'll just do without it. So those are the defenses that a market provides against a monopoly there. The way academic economists have studied monopoly and competition has led to a certain amount of intellectual confusion. There's a very well-known theory in standard neoclassical economic analysis called perfect competition. The theory of perfect competition is associated most closely with the English economist in the 30s, Joan Robinson. The way policymakers have actually applied some of her principles would be things that she wouldn't necessarily agree with. So I want to say that in her defense. But nonetheless, I think she kind of led us in an unfortunate direction. There's a tendency for academics to become too enamored of their own theories, to become too divorced from reality, to live in the ivory tower for too long. I guess that's why I'm so grateful for my involvement in this family business that we have, because I'm in the marketplace every day, and I do think it has kept my feet on the ground in terms of my economic theorizing and economic analysis, because I have to be aware of how the world really does work. Most of our economists tend to live in the ivory tower, and I think they suffer as a result. And I think one of the areas is this whole phenomenon, or this projected ideal of perfect competition. And how do you define perfect competition? And of course, they keep trying to tweak the definition. One definition says no seller would have more than 5% of the market. Well, that means there have to be at least 20 participants. The bottom line tends to be that the theory is construed in a way where basically no single producer can move the market, can have a major effect on a market. Well, that's not the way this world works. That's essentially saying that all economic participants are irrelevant and dispensable, and they're not. What decisions are made by individual firms impacts the market, shapes it, makes the market, it makes a difference. So to somehow theorize that the perfect competition would be a situation where no producer can influence the market is just divorced from everyday reality. It just doesn't have any common sense to it there. And it can lead to an absurdity. Somebody mentioned Boeing as a monopoly. It's the only producer in the United States of America, and I think one of maybe 3 or 4 in the world, of the jumbo jet airliners. And there's a reason for it, a very rational economic reason for it. There's a principle in economics that all of you, pardon me for repeating this for those of you who have already studied economics, but it's the basic principle of economies of scale. And for those of you who don't know that, basically what we're talking about, when a business goes into building something like airplanes, we divide the costs up into 2 categories. There are the fixed costs and the variable costs. The variable costs are the ones that vary according to how many units you build. I mean, if you build 100 jet airliners, you use more metal. And I'm not an engineer. What do they use now? Aluminum, titanium, steel, whatever they're using. Yeah, and then getting into the non-metals, the compounds and that. Okay, so whatever materials they're using, you're going to use more materials if you make 100 jets than if you make 10 jets. You're going to employ more hours of labor to make 100 jets than 10 jets. Those are the variable costs. But the fixed costs are the ones that you can't do anything about. They're the ones that they're the sunk costs. They're the research and development. It's the cost of building the factory where you're going to make these. And you don't know if you're going to make 10 or 100 or 200 or whatever. I mean, you hope you make a lot. You hope you get a lot of sales. But you don't really know. But whether you sell a lot or not, you're going to have to pay for that factory. And you've had to pay for the research and development. Those are the fixed costs. And those are considerable. They add up into the 10-figure, is that what a billion is? 10? I usually don't. Yeah, thank you. The billions, a couple billions of dollars to bring on a new jet airliner. Well, guess what? If you've got fixed costs of $2 billion and you only make 10 of them, you've got fixed costs of $200 million per unit that you have to kind of cover with your price. And that's going to make them unaffordable to most people. You'll have a lot fewer jet airliners out there. Whereas if you can make many of them and spread those massive fixed costs over a whole lot of units, your per unit cost will be much lower, and then therefore consumers with the lower price, the airlines, will be able to afford to buy more jet airliners. It's economically rational that there not be multiple producers or manufacturers of jet airliners. That's the way the market works. You know, the idea that one is automatically a bad number, that's a superstitious belief. That's a mystical belief. What we would say from our perspective, is trusting in markets, is let the market determine what the right number of producers is. It may be one or a few. To come up with some sort of academic theory that on an a priori basis says there should be a minimum of 20 competitors is essentially to say that we're going to have to outlaw economies of scale. We're going to have to conduct ourselves, the actual process of production is going to have to be economically inefficient and irrational and wasteful. And I don't think we really want to do that. So that's kind of the hazard of the theory, this idea that somehow there's a right number. It's like the just price issue. Those of you who have studied the history of economic thought are aware that Thomas Aquinas and other scholastic thinkers and philosophers were searching for what a just price was, and they never quite came up with an answer. And it's like, what's the right number of participants in an industry? Again, there's not really a right answer. Let the market determine what the price should be. Let the market determine what the number of participants in any particular industry should be. Yeah, it's the central planning conceit to assume that on an a priori basis you know how many participants there ought to be. In my microeconomics classes, I usually take 3 periods to discuss the topic we're talking about today in 1 hour, so I have to kind of, this is the greatest hits part of it, and again, for those of you who are already advanced students of economics, apologize for going over familiar ground, but it is important that everybody leave this university this week with basic understanding of some things. Now, what about the history of the way the government has tackled the monopoly issue? We've had antitrust and anti-monopoly laws for a long time. The first one was in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Law. I'm a little uncomfortable talking about antitrust. I prefer just anti-monopoly. The trusts, the trust busting of Theodore Roosevelt and the progressives. Trust was simply a legal structure, interlocking directorships, a little bit like the Japanese Zaibatsu. Somewhat antiquated, but the underlying economic principle is, okay, is there going to be competition or isn't there going to be competition? And as we've said, that government can outlaw competition by protecting an organization like the post office. In the private sphere, a firm may achieve a monopoly if they're doing the best that can be done without somebody else coming in and supplanting them or displacing them. And the Sherman Antitrust Law made it a felony to have or even attempt to achieve a monopoly by eliminating competition. And the politicians who passed that law said, now that doesn't mean that there can't be a monopoly as long as it's done the right way. But there's been an endless dispute about what the right way is. It gets litigated in the courts. So this is the ongoing hazard with legislation. It creates situations that maybe weren't anticipated. The intent was to not make it illegal for somebody to achieve a monopoly. In practice, it's made any firm that looks like it was going to be a monopoly a sitting duck, a target. It's like painting a bullseye on their back. It's kind of the law of unintended consequences biting us in the backside there. Yeah, the Sherman Antitrust Act said it was illegal to conspire against trade or commerce, domestic or foreign. You notice there's a double standard in that? It's illegal for a private business to engage in any restraint of trade with foreign countries. this is the same government that at that time, and to a lesser extent today, imposes trade barriers to impede free commerce with foreign countries. It's kind of a double standard. It's okay if the government restrains trade. It's not okay if a private business in some way acts to restrain trade. The other big act in the history of antitrust is the Clayton Act of 1914. These names, by the way, come from their legislative sponsors. I don't even remember Mr. Sherman's first name. He was a senator, and I don't remember Mr. Clayton's first name. It was kind of a fancy name. He was a representative from Alabama. But the Clayton Act of 1914 took the Sherman Act a little bit farther. Under the Sherman Act, only the government could file suit against the company for anti-competitive practices. The Clayton Act authorized private parties, other firms, to initiate lawsuits against firms that they perceived as behaving in an anti-competitive or monopolistic way. And of course, that's going to open the flood door to lots of mischief, I think, as you can anticipate there. There was one very explicit and notable loophole in the Clayton Act in terms of its enforcement. I think there was a lesser one, but the main one that I'm thinking of is labor unions. You know, when you think about it, a labor union is a monopoly. When a labor union is recognized under current labor law in the United States, the employing firm either employs members of that union or they don't employ anybody. They have to hire union members. The union has a monopoly in supplying labor to that business or that industry, like the domestic auto companies. So interesting that even though there was this move against monopoly, there was this prevailing idea that monopolies are bad because they're abusive, because they will overcharge, because they will create inefficiencies. There was an explicit exception made for whatever overcharging, whatever inefficiencies would result from a union having a monopoly of labor in a particular line of business. And there's also the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 establishing one of the myriad government agencies, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, and you still hear about that from time to time. That's kind of an administrative arm of this whole thing. But what you have here in practice, there's great intellectual confusion about this whole idea of monopoly and protecting competition and so on and so forth. A former fee trustee by the name of Dominic Armentano was a great professor of economics at the University of Connecticut. And his famous book, Antitrust and Monopoly, contains a very readable history of a lot of the early antitrust cases. You know, there's the one against Standard Oil, American Tobacco, U.S. Steel. These were the industrial titans, the giants of the late 19th century. And sure enough, they were prosecuted for looking like they might achieve monopolies. They were just getting so big, they had such a dominant market share that they were hauled before the courts and accused of striving or conspiring, whatever you want to call it, to hinder competition by working to achieve a monopoly. And it's true, the market share of these firms was increasing. There's no doubt about it. But the reason, if we remember our economic rationale, if you remember why it is that we object to monopolies, because we're afraid they're going to take advantage of their dominant position in a market to overcharge, to rip the people off. There's a very interesting historical record there, an indisputable fact. At the time it was being prosecuted, and for years before and for years afterward, Standard Oil was providing kerosene and other refined products of petroleum to customers for a lower price than their competition. Can you imagine the evil of that giant corporation? What nerve they must have had to charge the people lower prices. I don't think the American consumer was protesting and marching in the streets about this. It was the same thing with U.S. Steel. These were the most efficient producers, and they were charging the lowest prices, not the highest prices. You know, the old medieval monopolies, they charged high prices because they could get away with it. They ripped off the people. They took advantage of them. These firms did have competitors. There were no barriers to competitors. Grove City College, for example, was started by a member of the Pew family, P-E-W. You've probably heard of Pew Charitable Trusts. That's that fortune went into a foundation that's still active today. And the Pew fortune was made through the establishment of a little company called Sunoco. And this company came into existence and grew and thrived right during the heyday of John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Nothing kept them from entering the market. You just had to be very, very efficient and low cost in order to survive in that market because of the great efficiency of Standard Oil. So here we had American companies essentially being persecuted and prosecuted because they were giving the American consumer the lowest price. That's intellectual confusion of the first magnitude. You know, it's interesting how often government tends to be, government likes to say that they're the friend of all of us. They're here to help us. And yet, think of how many different acts government passes that result in higher prices. You know, all the business taxes, I mean, you have a lot of people say, yeah, sock it to the businesses. They can afford it. You know, they've got too much money. Tax the businesses. Who pays business taxes? Well, consumers, investors, employees of the firm. It's people. And all those taxes have to be paid for. The prices are higher than they otherwise would be because of all the taxes embedded in them. Every employee's Social Security tax and income tax, that comes out of the revenue of the firm. Prices are higher than they otherwise would be because of all the government taxes. I mentioned protectionism before. Protectionism is designed to, from the consumer point of view, protectionism is designed to impose higher prices on American consumers. The antitrust laws were used to prosecute firms for charging lower prices. I guess from that we infer that the government would prefer that consumers pay higher prices. It seems a little bit odd. Makes you wonder what the goal really is there. Under these laws, we find that companies can get in trouble for doing a lot of things with their prices. They can be sued for what's called predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is the theory that a ruthless corporation will slash their prices to the bone in order to drive their competitors out of business, and then will rush in to scoop up the pieces and establish a monopoly. It's an interesting theory. I've read literature by some of the top business writers, and they defy people, they challenge people to name one instance where that theory has played out from beginning to end. Of course there are times when competitive firms cut their prices in order to expand market share. The great global struggle between Kodak and Fujifilm is a classic example of that. But neither one knocks out the other. You know, one will go into the other company's home territory and slash prices and increase their market share, and the other one will retaliate by going into the other home country and slashing prices and increasing market share. What's happening to the consumer in this process? They're getting lower prices. I mean, the corporations may be bleeding some capital. The corporations may be slashing their profits to the bone so that the consumer can have lower prices. It's to our advantage. Why do we want the government to stop this? And yet, it can be considered, because of the theory of predatory pricing, you can go after a firm legally for charging those low prices. You say that's predatory behavior. They're doing this for the purpose of establishing a monopoly. And so, Who files suits? You know, again, the consumer's not marching in the street. The consumer's not hiring a lawyer to sue these guys for the lower prices. Generally, the incentive here is for the firm that's losing the competition to sue the firm that's defeating them for charging lower prices. In other words, one firm can't win in the marketplace, maybe can't survive in the marketplace, but they want to survive. I guess that's certainly understandable. So they use the courts to try to weaken their competition, to try to preserve their market share, even though that means consumers then would pay higher prices than they otherwise would. You know, that's the low price thing. It's also against the law under these antitrust, anti-monopoly laws for firms to conspire with each other. The legal term is collusion. They're not allowed to collude, to make behind, you know, under the table, behind the doors, agreements to fix prices. And you can get in trouble for the high prices. You know, every time gas prices would go up, you always hear some demagogic politician talk about price gouging. After Hurricane Katrina, there was a story where, you know, the gas price at that time went from like $2.20 to $3.20 a gallon in a day, in the blink of an eye. Because markets do adjust prices very rapidly in real time. But there was a story of a couple of service stations in different parts of the country that instead of raising their price from $2.20 to $3.20 a gallon, they were charging $5 and $6 a gallon. And of course then people say, I see, you've got to stop those predatory merchants from doing that to people. But why? Can there be a rational reason that they did that? Can there be an economically valid reason they raised their prices that high, do you think? Or were they just doing it to be mean, to take advantage? There's an economic explanation. And that is, maybe their reservoir, their supply on hand of gasoline was really low, and they were expecting a delivery the next day, but because of the emergency in Louisiana and Mississippi, they knew that a lot of fuel might be diverted there, or a lot of fuel might be prevented from coming up north. They didn't really know what the situation was. And so by raising prices, what do? That reduces the amount that consumers will demand. I don't know too many of us who, if there were two service stations in town in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and one wanted $3 a gallon, the other wanted $6 a gallon, which one would you go to? Well, there'd probably be a flood of people going into the $3 a gallon station. But by virtue of everybody going there, you might have a long line. You might have to wait 30 minutes or an hour. We used to have gas lines in the 70s due to price controls on fuel in this country where people would wait in the lines for a couple of hours to get gasoline. Well, what if you need to get somewhere really fast? What if there's an emergency? What if you've got a chance to see your true love for the first time in 6 months? I mean, you don't care what you pay for the gas. And so the few people who want to be able to be sure that they're going to have gas, they don't care what it costs in that situation. They don't want to have to wait in line. They just want to be able to get there and get it. That's performing a service. That's rationing a scarce good, which is what prices do. And there's really a more fundamental reason why they should be able to charge $6 a gallon if they want to. It's their fuel. I mean, would you want somebody saying how much you can ask for the used car that you're trying to sell? Or when mom and dad are selling the house, do you think the government should impose a limit as to how much they can ask for their house? You know, are they price gougers because they want to get top dollar for what they have? No. That's just economically normal behavior. There's nothing inherently evil or unethical about it. It's just the way things work. But you see, what we end up with then, under this whole anti-monopoly theory, and the practice of it in law, is that a company can get in trouble for price gouging, for charging prices that are too high. They can get in trouble for price collusion by keeping their prices the same. And they can get sued for predatory pricing, for setting their prices too low. In fact, I have heard, and I wish I could remember the specific company, but I remember hearing a speaker once tell of a company that was being sued at that time. One lawsuit was for having prices too high, and another lawsuit was for having prices too low. You know, the government might have thought their prices were too high. The competition might have thought their prices were too low. I don't remember who the plaintiffs were in this suit. But this is confusion of the first magnitude. Because it means that a business can get in trouble for not changing their prices, or for raising their prices, or for lowering their prices. In other words, potentially, we have the possibility here that businesses are always guilty of something. And so the way it plays out in practice depends on who's got what agenda and how the lawyers are going to tweak the law. And if you who go into law someday, this is the kind of fun stuff. It's like Alice in Wonderland. I don't get it myself, but that's the way the game's played out there. And you can see what tremendous nonsense that it boils down to. We've just not thought through, or at least we don't have a consistently applied standard in terms of our concerns about monopoly. If you can have this ridiculous situation where prices can be too high, too low, or the same, and still get some firm in trouble. It's crazy. And another idea of the confusion is that you can, you know, we say the whole purpose of these laws was to guarantee that there would be competition. You know, it sounds like rah-rah, free market. And yet, nobody's allowed to win the competition. You can't actually win it, you'd be a monopolist. And they said when they passed the Sherman Antitrust law that, well, that's not really what they meant. But lawyers and plaintiffs have gone ahead and operated on that basis anyhow. You know, imagine watching the NBA playoffs here, the Stanley Cup Finals, and one of the teams starts to win. Timeout, game over. You're not, you know, don't bring it to a conclusion. I just got a signal here that I'm getting near the end, so I thought I had an hour and then 15 minutes, but I think we lost the 15 minutes from the lecture part instead of the question part. Bottom line, anti-monopoly laws. Always ask yourself the question, cui bono? Who benefits? Okay, that's the Latin phrase. For whose good is it? Who does it help to have these laws that will go after corporations? Well, certainly the anti-market leftists, the ideologues, the people who just hate capitalism. Secondly, the losers in competition, the people who are the weaker competitors. They're not making it on their own, so they're enlisting the government's help, the rent-seeking. And we'll talk more about rent-seeking in the next lecture. And then there's probably the government. The government wants to be, you know, always wants to be the boss. And you had a double standard during the New Deal where FDR was establishing cartels. You know, private firms aren't allowed to establish cartels, but during the New Deal, Uncle Sam was surely allowed to establish cartels. Is Uncle Sam really the friend of consumers? I don't think so. Do you want me to stop now, Ben, and take questions?
Sure.
Is that the time? Because we're going to go to 10:15 now, and then the next one will be at 10:30. Okay. So I didn't even get to tell you my Jane Fonda theory of political science here in monopoly. So yes, sir.
Since we were saying competition in a free market, free government intervention would ultimately always produce the best result for consumers.
No. I prefer competition. Yes. Will free competition always produce the best results? Relatively speaking, it's the preferable alternative, but I'm uncomfortable with anything that smacks of a utopian solution. We live in an imperfect world. I'm not trying to say that, you know, I would never say that every businessman is, you know, a caring, loving neighbor who wants to do what he can for the consumer. I mean, a lot of them will just do whatever they can to extract wealth from them. But as long as they have to do it honestly, by not breaking any laws, without any fraud, as long as they're subject to competition, that's the thing. A lot of times it's the big businesses that like to limit the competition so they can keep the market to themselves. Yeah, the leftists who gripe about big business, and this is where the Jane Fonda theory comes in, okay? Jane Fonda was very famous in 1980 for wanting the U.S. government to nationalize our oil industry because the oil industry was perceived to be an oligopoly, which is the first cousin of monopoly, that there were just a few dominant producers. Now, actually, the oil market's a lot bigger than Jane Fonda realized. There are some 5,000 oil companies in this country. It's nowhere close to being a monopoly. But nonetheless, the big ones that dominated the news headlines had the dominant share of gasoline. They controlled maybe 90% of the gasoline sold in this country. And she was concerned about them earning too many profits during the oil shortages of the late 70s. So her solution, what was her solution to an oligopoly? Her solution was a monopoly. Let the government nationalize the oil industry. Now, how's that going to promote competition, folks? I suppose if you're of the religious persuasion that if somebody works for government, that they're somehow sanctified and a saint and no longer motivated by self-interest and greed and all the sins of which business people are guilty, then you might endorse her particular theory. But I would say to Jane Fonda and anybody else, look, if you really want to keep the oil companies on their toes, or in any other business, if you want to keep them responsive to consumers, if you want to discipline them, if you want to keep them from becoming overbearing and dominant, then keep them exposed to the maximum degree possible to competition. Because it's the competition that they're more afraid of than anything else. It's the competition that forces them to be more efficient. That freedom of entry is primary. Freedom. Let the market work. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Could the Clayton Act potentially be used to apply it to labor unions, or does it have an exclusion?
Yeah, the Clayton Act does exclude monopolies in the case of labor unions. We have a glaring inconsistency in U.S. law. Labor law has departed from the standard of, it's got the special exemption there. Yes. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask, could you comment on monopsony? Because it seems that, Walmart's a huge buyer of retail products that, if Walmart buys my product, then it's either going to make or break my business, or even for like Boeing. I mean, they're going to buy plane wings or whatever, and whether they buy from me, it's almost like this feeling of, well, they can get the most out of me, and almost kind of they're taking advantage of me.
Yeah, the question here is monopsony, which is kind of the flip side of a monopoly. A monopoly means there's one provider. A monopsony means there's one buyer. And I assume by bringing up Walmart, you're thinking of how Walmart buys so much of China's output and so on and so forth. Walmart is, again, it's a giant. It's huge. It's the predominant player in its niche. But it's nowhere near a monopoly. And it's so interesting in the history of business in this country how transient big businesses are. A&P once was the dominant supermarket chain. Most people have never even seen an A&P anymore. I'd like to read a list of the Dow 30 companies that were the companies that comprised the Dow 30 stock index at the time of the Great Crash in October of 1929, and there's only a couple of them that are still in the index. There's a tremendous amount of transition. Once Montgomery Ward was a leader, then J.C. Penney was a leader, then Sears was a leader, now Walmart. I mean, the situation is very fluid. Will Walmart still be the dominant retail outlet 50 years from now? Well, I don't know the future. I'm only an economist. I would say it's possible, but based on history, don't count on it. So, again, as long as there's freedom of entry, who's to say somebody else, the next generation of business managers at another corporation, aren't going to find a way to streamline costs more than Walmart has? Well, Walmart's been tremendously efficient, and they use information technology to achieve a lot of their efficiencies. They have more computing power at their disposal than any other entity in this country except the Pentagon. Will they stay on top? Only as long as they do a better job of serving those consumers and controlling costs and managing information than anybody else. But there's always a better idea coming down the pike. So I don't think you have to worry about Walmart or any other firm becoming a monopsony. Yes?
Should a company suppress entry into their field? Would that justify the government regulating that company?
Should a company suppress competition? I always take the side of the consumer in this. I'm not sure. Are you thinking of a specific case, like the Netscape browser or something like that?
Well, I know, the specific example I had was in the, I believe, the 1930s or maybe I forgot when it was, somewhere in the 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt introduced this idea of renationalization because state corporations were suppressing competition, but because they were also private state legislators were enabled to enact legislation that competed with those corporations, so he wanted to nationalize and strengthen the federal government to deal with those corporations.
Well, again, okay, he was talking about apparently one time there were business leaders who were bribing state legislators. Gee, nobody bribes government anymore, do they? The whole political process runs on money. Who was H.L. Mencken once said that every election is an advance auction of stolen goods or something of that nature. And it was brought up, well, Teddy Roosevelt proposed nationalizing these companies to somehow, what, make them more competitive? I mean, that wouldn't. I do not see, I would put that in the same category as Jane Fonda. I don't see where the end of your problems is to establish a government monopoly. And you look at the post office in this country, you look at virtually any business in a socialist country, and a government monopoly just is not the friend of the consumer. It inefficiently uses resources. The quality is often shoddy. The service is terrible because you come to the counter and you grumble about something and they say, take it or leave it. Who needs you? Because they've got. So I don't think any sort of government monopoly or even government management. I mean, why would somehow the people who are employed by government be benign in their approach, whereas private business people are the ones that are always the guilty ones? Let me call my friend Frank, because he's been in international business for many years. Frank.
I think of price controls and what happened in the Nixon era and the confusion with that and what happened with businesses when we talk about the hand of government.
Mm-hmm.
At one time when I started working in Russia, I put 17 distributors online with the idea that we would get away from this idea of going to the state stores. And so these distributors, they're all learning how competition works. And they're always interested in what's the other person charging, what's the market look like, how can I get market share. And what was happening is that on a monthly basis, when the prices started out way up here at this level, because they were at a state level, and then when the competition started coming in, you saw how the consumers were benefiting. Now the distributors were screaming, but they were doing business and they were making money. And as their prices came down, they did more volume, they got better goods in because they wanted to supply them to the consumers that wanted them. And we saw this whole pricing structure come down, and now they're rabid capitalists for the most part. If you were to talk with the people that are in business and have survived and made it over these last 14 years or so.
Thank you, Frank. Yes. Yes.
It's about Walmart again. So Walmart offers me cheap crap and impersonal service. I hate shopping at Walmart. But maybe one day I'm a little more wealthy and I can shop at the next tier. I mean, is that the trade-off we give? Is that the economic ideal?
The question is it the economic ideal? He hates Walmart. Let me ask you, do you shop there, Adam?
I avoid it at all costs.
Okay. And that's your prerogative. See, as long as we have a choice, and the problem is in the socialist economy, you have zero choice. Now, admittedly, in the small towns of like John Day, Oregon, people have minimal choices. That's the big gripe about Walmart. I don't like it's too big, it's too impersonal, it's this or that or the other thing. I don't dispute that. Reminds me of what George Bernard Shaw said when one of his plays was debuted. And afterwards, there was thunderous applause. And Shaw came out on stage, and then one person in the audience booed. He said, that was garbage. And Shaw says, my dear sir, I quite agree with you. But what are we among so many? You and I might not like to shop at Walmart, but a lot of people do. Now, maybe it's just for utilitarian reasons. Maybe they don't get any aesthetic joy out of it, but they go there instead of somewhere else. If they didn't, it wouldn't be as big as it is. They are as big as they are because of what free Americans are choosing to do, where they're choosing to shop. You may not agree with the majority taste here in America. I often find myself in a minority when it comes to the tastes that prevail in our culture and our society. That is part of the price of freedom. We're not always going to have it our way. There are going to be factors out there that we're not particularly keen about. Yes.
In the event that a business is dangerous, what guarantee exists that a private industry will remain safe? Like, is that when government monopoly becomes the industry of nuclear energy or the industry of something that the consumer needs some sort of guarantee that it's being done in a correct manner.
Wow. Consumer guarantee done in a correct manner. Can the government do that better than the marketplace? Again, I don't want to be utopian about this and say that if you have a free market, all problems are solved harmoniously and quickly or anything like that. I'm just saying that in an imperfect world, you're better off with having options like you do in a market than having a government monopoly. I'm not quite sure what you're getting at with the nuclear energy part.
Yes. Well, no. Okay. Let me rephrase it. Like, if a business is dangerous, does that justify a government monopoly?
Well, what's a dangerous business? Is a gun manufacturer a dangerous business?
Yes.
See, I would say no. I would say what's dangerous are people who would use guns to violate the rights of their fellow man. I'd say what is laudable is somebody using a gun to defend their rights from being preyed upon by their fellow man. It's the morality, the ethics of it is the choice that a human being makes in terms of the use of something. I don't view a gun as inherently good or evil. I view it as morally neutral. I view the choices that human beings make in using a gun. It's the same thing with nuclear energy. When you split the atom and you can use that to vaporize 250,000 people in 10 seconds, I'm not really keen about that. When you use it to provide cheap, unpolluting power to millions of people, I think that has something to be said for it.
It is polluting.
Okay, you can talk about the relative degrees of pollution. Again, we don't have immaculate production in this country. Okay, let's not get off on the tangent of nuclear energy. Okay, this is a talk about monopoly. But you two guys will have a nice talk about nukes. Okay, I've got about 1 minute left. We got time for a quickie there.
Would you consider some kind of minimal regulations for those kind of so-called natural monopolies like power, electric companies, which some costs are so high that for all practical purposes limit the entry of new competitors?
Should there be maybe an exception made for, say, something like public utilities where there's this enormous capital investment and it maybe doesn't make sense for there to be two participants or more in a market?
At least minimal.
Yeah, well, you're almost anticipating what the lead point is going to be in my next lecture, so I kind of will defer on that part of it. But, again, we don't live in an imperfect world, and my libertarian friends will hate me for saying this. Maybe, just maybe, we can survive with there being a little bit of, look, I'm not, let me defer the answer for 15 minutes, because I'm going to start off my next lecture by making a point that comes to that. And I think...
I was going to say, Mark, with that particular example, there are public rate commissions that govern every utility. And they sit down and they discuss all of that price structure.
I think his question is whether that should be the case, whether there should be those regulatory agencies. Ben, it's 10:15. Should we stop now?
Thank you, Mark.
All right. See you in 15 minutes.